Dominic "Dom" Caruso was only 37 years old, but he already controlled half of Boston's underworld from behind the polished façade of Caruso Holdings, a multi-million-dollar real estate empire that stretched from Back Bay to the dockyards of South Boston. He wore three-piece suits tailored in Milan, drove a black Rolls-Royce with tinted windows, and spoke in a voice so low and calm that grown men trembled when he whispered. Because in Dom's world, when he lowered his voice, someone was about to lose something they would never get back. His fiancée, Bianca Whitfield, was a 31-year-old former model who knew exactly how to smile for the cameras and cry on cue. The kind of woman who looked like devotion in a designer dress but calculated every kiss like a business transaction. On the night that changed everything, Dom was riding home from a secret meeting where he had just closed the biggest deal of his career. Rain hammered the windshield. City lights bled through the glass. His phone buzzed with Bianca's name, but he did not answer because he wanted to tell her in person. He wanted to see her face light up the way it used to, not knowing those would be the last sounds he would ever hear for a very long time. The SUV came out of nowhere at a dead intersection. No plates, no warning, just blinding headlights, and then the sickening crunch of metal folding like paper. And the world went black. 4 days later, Dom woke up in a hospital bed with a shattered arm, cracked ribs, and a silence so absolute it felt like being buried alive. The doctors told him, scribbling on a whiteboard since he could not hear a single word, that the trauma had destroyed his inner ear, and the chances of recovery were almost non-existent. But here is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Not Bianca, not Franco Duca, the ambitious trader who had been waiting for Dom to fall, and certainly not Josie Reyes, a 27-year-old single mother from Dorchester who'd been scrubbing hotel floors and washing dishes just to keep her 2-year-old son, Tommy, fed and her dying mother in a nursing home she could not afford. Josie walked into Dom's mansion carrying a torn duffel bag and a baby on her hip. She had no idea she had just stepped into the most dangerous household in Massachusetts, but she also had no idea that her quiet kindness, her handwritten notes, her son's tiny hand on a mafia boss's scarred cheek, and a lullaby she sang every night thinking no one could hear would become the only sounds that pulled the most feared man in Boston back from the edge of darkness and showed him what it truly means to be loved when you have nothing left to offer. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who believes real love still exists, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss a single chapter of what happens next. Now let us get back to today's story and find out exactly how a lullaby in the dark brought the most dangerous man in Boston to his knees. The fluorescent lights in the VIP hospital room at Massachusetts General Hospital flickered like the pulse of a heart about to stop. Dominic Caruso lay there amid IV lines and the beeping of a monitor he could no longer hear. His left arm rested in a cast, suspended on a support, 3 cracked ribs on his right side turning every breath into a knife slicing through him, a stitched wound nearly 10 centimeters long on his forehead, still seeping blood through the white bandage. Yet all that physical pain was nothing compared to the sensation of sinking into a bottomless well with no sound to cling to. Bianca sat on the chair beside the bed, her eyes swollen and red, her lips moving non-stop as if whispering words of comfort. But Dom only saw her mouth moving like a silent film without subtitles. Something about the way she cried felt strange to him. The tears falling on cue, the shoulders shaking at just the right rhythm, the hand resting on his chest in exactly the right place, as if she had rehearsed this scene in front of a mirror many times. But Dom pushed the thought away because he did not want to doubt the only woman still sitting beside him at this moment. Dr. Harrison Webb entered the room with the eyes of a man who had served the Caruso family for 20 years and had never had to deliver news this bad. Holding a whiteboard, he wrote each word slowly and clearly so Dom could read it. Cochlear trauma on both sides is extremely severe. The auditory nerves are badly damaged. The chance of recovery is extremely low. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility of permanent deafness." Dom finished reading the sentence, looked up at the doctor's face, then down at his right hand that was still intact, the hand that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that had grabbed traitors by the collar, that had raised a glass to toast victories amid crowds filled with fear and respect. Now lying helpless on a white hospital sheet, trembling beyond his control, he tried to open his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out felt distorted and unfamiliar, like someone else borrowing his mouth, and that sensation made him want to scream. Yet he was afraid even the scream would be swallowed by the silence imprisoning him. The days in the hospital were a living hell for a man who had built an entire empire on sharp ears and a voice that made people kneel. All communication now had to go through written notes and whiteboards. Emergency meetings with his men turned into slow, suffocating exchanges of scribbled messages. Dom wrote orders without knowing whether his subordinates would follow them correctly because he could not hear immediate responses, could not read tone, could not distinguish truth from lies through handwriting alone. He saw in the eyes of those who once trembled before him something different now, part pity, part calculation, because in the world Dom ruled, a boss who could not hear meant a boss who could not control, and a boss who could not control was nothing but prey, waiting to be torn apart. During the long nights in the hospital room, when Bianca had gone home and the nurses had turned off the lights, Dom lay staring at the stark white ceiling as memories flooded in, like a silent torrent. He remembered his father's voice, old Enzo Caruso, rough with cigarette smoke and whiskey, teaching him his first lesson about power when he was 12. He remembered the first gunshot he ever heard at 14 when he watched his father deal with a traitor in a warehouse in Southie. He remembered his mother Rose's clear laughter, the only woman in the world who dared call Enzo Caruso an idiot and made him laugh in return, a laughter that went silent when she died of cancer, when Dom was 20. And his father never laughed again until the day he, too, was laid to rest. All those sounds were now only ghosts in Dom's mind. He could hear them in memory, but knew he would never hear any real sound again. That thought pressed on his chest heavier than all 3 broken ribs combined. Franco Duca came to visit one day, entering the room with a bouquet of flowers and a face full of concern. Writing on the whiteboard, "Rest easy. I'll handle everything outside. No one will dare touch Caruso Holdings while I'm here." Dom read the words and nodded, but he noticed Franco's eyes were not on him as he wrote. Instead, they swept across the room, lingering on the file folder on the table, on Dom's phone, on Bianca sitting in the corner. And that gaze was not worried. It was an inventory. The look of a vulture measuring how long its prey still had to breathe. News of Dom's accident and condition spread through the Boston underworld like wildfire. Rival gangs in Charlestown and East Boston began probing the borders of the territory Dom controlled, testing shipments through routes no one had dared touch before. Some legitimate business partners started delaying payments and avoiding meetings. The empire Dom had built over nearly 20 years was shaking like a building without a foundation. And amid all that chaos, only one man stood unmoved. Paulie Greco, 45 years old, his right arm still bandaged from the night of the accident, standing guard outside Dom's hospital room around the clock without complaint, without asking for pay, without needing orders. Because Paulie had followed Dom since they were just errand-running kids for old Enzo in the Southie slums. And Paulie's loyalty was not something money could buy or fear could shake. It was forged in blood and time. And as long as Paulie stood in front of that door, the outside world needed to understand that Dominic Caruso might be deaf, might have a broken arm, might lie motionless on a hospital bed. But he was not dead yet. Anyone who thought this was the moment to strike should think very carefully again. While Dominic Caruso lay in a VIP hospital room with Paulie guarding the door and the entire Boston underworld circling outside, less than 15 kilometers to the south, in a studio apartment no bigger than a bathroom in a Beacon Hill mansion, Josephine Reyes jolted awake in the middle of a Boston winter, with the temperature outside dropping below -10 degrees, while the room's heater had been broken for 3 weeks and the landlord had not bothered to fix it, despite her calling 7 times. The studio sat on the 3rd floor of a crumbling building in Dorchester. Cracks ran from ceiling to floor like veins on an aging hand. Peeling paint exposed damp, mold-stained brick beneath. The single window was sealed with a sheet of clear plastic because the glass had shattered in the fall, and Josie could not afford to replace it. Tommy slept in an old crib she had bought secondhand from a Goodwill store for $12. The child curled beneath 2 layers of blankets because the room was too cold, his tiny breaths forming thin white clouds in the air. Josie stood watching him with her chest tightening as if squeezed by an unseen hand, because she knew a 2-year-old should not be sleeping in cold like this. But she had no other choice. Her hands shook as she opened the refrigerator to take out the last container of formula to prepare for Tommy. Inside, there was only half a loaf of white bread, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, and 2 eggs, enough for Tommy's breakfast, while Josie would skip eating, as she always did because she always skipped, so her child would have enough. She stood in the narrow kitchen, waiting for the milk to warm, and memories came uninvited. She remembered the night she fled Ryan Dutton's apartment in Brockton when she was 6 months pregnant with Tommy. Her face bruised, lips swollen, belly heavy, yet she still ran into the street in the middle of the night under the rain with nothing but a backpack and her identification. A woman driving by saw her crying at a bus stop and took her to Rosie's Place, the oldest shelter for homeless women in the United States, located right in Boston. Josie lived there for the final 4 months of her pregnancy, gave birth to Tommy in a hospital as a homeless woman on Medicaid. Then she saved every dollar from night dishwashing shifts and daytime cleaning jobs for a full year to afford the deposit on this battered studio she called home. On the kitchen table lay a stack of mail Josie was afraid to open but had to read. Bills from the skilled nursing facility where her mother, Carmen Reyes, was staying after severe diabetic complications had cost her right leg up to the knee 8 months earlier. The bill was now 2 months overdue, with the latest letter warning that if payment was not made within 7 days, they would be forced to transfer her mother to a public facility with far lower quality of care. Beside the bills was a white envelope bearing the logo of a law firm Josie recognized immediately because this was the 3rd time she had received it. Inside was a letter from the attorney representing Ryan Dutton stating that their client wished to exercise visitation rights and was considering filing for custody, even though Ryan had never once met Tommy since the child was born, even though he had never sent a single dollar in support, even though he was the man who had punched her 6-month pregnant belly on the night she escaped. Josie set the letter down and looked toward the crib where Tommy was still sleeping, the child shifting and murmuring in his dream. She swallowed her tears, telling herself silently that she just needed to get through today. Just needed Tommy to have milk this morning. Just needed her mother to have a bed for this week. Everything else could wait. Josie left Tommy with her downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Nguyen, a 60-year-old Vietnamese woman living alone who kindly watched Tommy for free in exchange for Josie helping with grocery runs on weekends. Then Josie took the Orange Line subway to the Four Seasons Hotel where she worked a housekeeping shift from morning until afternoon. Mid-shift, while Josie was scrubbing the bathroom floor of a suite on the 12th floor, the housekeeping manager called her to the office and informed her that the hotel owner's family was urgently hiring a live-in housekeeper to care for a family member who had just suffered a serious accident. The job included cooking, cleaning, and daily assistance, paid 5 times her current wage, with room and board provided at a private mansion, and crucially, permission to bring her small child. Josie asked which family, and when she heard the name Caruso, the blood in her veins seemed to chill for a beat, because anyone who had lived in Boston long enough had heard the rumors about Dominic Caruso. People said he controlled half the city. People said those who betrayed him vanished without a trace. People said even the police did not dare knock on his door. Josie was about to refuse, but at that exact moment her phone vibrated with a message from the skilled nursing facility, a final reminder about her mother's overdue bill. Josie looked at the message, then thought of Tommy sleeping in the freezing room, thought of Ryan's lawyer letter, thought of the empty refrigerator, and she understood that the fear of Dominic Caruso was not as terrifying as the fear of being unable to feed her child. So she looked up at the manager and said she would take the job, asking when she could start. Shortly after accepting the job, Josie stood before the wrought iron gate of the mansion on Beacon Hill on a gray winter morning. Tommy on her left hip, a travel bag torn at the right shoulder, hanging from her arm. Inside, it was everything the two of them owned. A few worn clothes, 2 containers of formula, the threadbare teddy bear Tommy never let go of, and a stack of identification papers sealed carefully in a Ziploc plastic bag because they were the most valuable thing Josie possessed. The gate opened, and Josie stepped into a world she had only ever seen on television. The foyer floor was paved with white and gray Italian marble, polished so smooth she could see her reflection beneath her feet. A dark oak spiral staircase curved up to the second floor, with intricately carved banisters. Original paintings on the walls. Artists Josie did not know, but each was certainly worth more than the studio she had just given up. The scent of oak mingled with leather from the sofas in the living room, creating a fragrance Josie had never smelled before. The smell of money, of power, of a world that did not belong to her. Tommy's round eyes widened as he looked around, his tiny hand pointing up at the crystal chandelier hanging from the center of the ceiling, letting out a long, astonished, "Oh!" And that sound was the only thing that broke the heavy silence of the house until the click of high heels echoed across the marble from the hallway. Bianca Whitfield appeared in a cream silk dress, blonde hair perfectly waved, makeup immaculate, and she looked Josie up and down with a glance quick but thorough enough to take in everything. The scuffed silver sneakers, the thin coat not warm enough, the black hair pulled into a simple ponytail, the child on her hip wearing a faded onesie. Josie saw the corner of Bianca's mouth twitch before a polite smile slid into place to cover the disdain. Bianca said, "Welcome," in a sweet voice, but her eyes did not smile. Then she turned to the butler beside her and said quietly, but loudly enough for Josie to hear, "Couldn't you find anyone better? She even brought a child in here." Josie heard every word, but her expression did not change. She'd been accustomed to being looked down on long before Bianca. Ryan had taught her how to swallow humiliation without breaking, so she only held Tommy a little tighter and followed the butler down a long corridor to the room assigned to her in the rear wing of the house. A small room, but clean and warm 100 times over compared to the studio in Dorchester, with a double bed, a crib for Tommy, and a fireplace that worked properly. Josie had to bite her lip to keep from crying because for the first time in nearly 3 years, her son would sleep in a warm room. After setting their things down and giving Tommy his milk, the butler led Josie to Dom's study on the first floor for introductions. But before entering, he looked at her with an expression that was half warning and half pity, and murmured that Mr. Caruso was in a very bad mood and she should prepare herself. Josie nodded, lifted Tommy in her arms, and stepped through the heavy oak door into a dim room with the curtains drawn tight, the faint smell of old whiskey lingering in the air. She saw a figure sitting motionless in a large leather armchair with his back to the door, face turned toward the closed window, his left arm in a cast resting on the arm of the chair, not turning around even though the door had opened because he could not hear anything. Josie stood there for a few seconds, unsure what to do. Then she stepped forward and gently placed her right hand on Dom's left shoulder, just enough pressure for him to register another person's presence without startling him too violently. But Dom still spun around with the speed of a man who had lived his entire life on alert. Dark eyes sharp as blades locked onto Josie's face with fierce weariness, jaw clenched, body tensed, and ready to react. In that instant, Josie understood why all of Boston feared this man, because even sitting helpless in a chair with a broken arm, cracked ribs, and complete deafness, that gaze alone could make anyone step back. But Josie did not step back. She had faced Ryan Dutton's fists in the middle of the night. She had given birth alone in a hospital with no one holding her hand. She had slept on a shelter floor for 4 months, so the cold stare of a mafia boss was not enough to make her run. She met his gaze with eyes that held neither fear nor pity, only calm, then reached for the whiteboard and marker on the table beside the chair and wrote each word clearly and neatly. "I am Josie. I am here to help you. This is Tommy, my son. He can be a little noisy, but he is very well behaved." She held the board up for Dom to read. At that moment, Tommy squirmed in her arms, wanting down. Josie set him on the wooden floor, and the child immediately crawled to the foot of the armchair, plopping down beside Dom's black leather shoes and beginning to play with his threadbare teddy bear as if this were his own living room. Unafraid, unhesitant, completely at ease in the presence of the man the entire city feared. Dom read the words on the board, then looked down at the child babbling to his teddy bear at his feet, then looked back up at Josie standing before him in her thin coat with those steady eyes, and he nodded once slowly without expression, without speaking, without sending her away. Josie understood that in the language of Dominic Caruso, a single nod meant a great deal. Josie's first week in the Beacon Hill mansion was a silent war she had to fight every single day without being allowed to lose even once. Dom Caruso was not an easy patient. He was a caged beast, and rage born from helplessness was the only thing he could still unleash without needing his hearing. One morning, when Josie brought breakfast into the study, she set the tray on the desk and wrote on the whiteboard, asking if he wanted anything else. Dom read the line and then knocked the board to the floor, shattering it because her writing was too small, and he could not read it in the dim light of the curtained room. Then he slammed his hand on the desk, sending the coffee cup spilling across the folder he had been reading. Josie stood still, watching it happen without flinching, without stepping back, without shaking, without crying. She simply waited for his anger to subside, then calmly bent down to pick up the broken board, wiped the coffee from the desk, took out a new larger whiteboard she had already prepared because she knew the old one would eventually be thrown, and rewrote the same sentence in letters twice as large and clearer, placing it in front of him with a fresh marker. Dom looked at the new board, looked up at Josie, and for the first time something like surprise flickered in those sharp eyes because he was not used to someone who did not fear him when he exploded. One day he hurled a glass of water at the wall because Polly brought the wrong documents. Josie silently wiped the water, picked up the broken glass, replaced the cup without a single complaint. Another day he swept everything off his desk onto the floor because of the frustration of not being able to make himself understood through written notes. Josie put everything back exactly where it had been, as if nothing had happened. She never looked at him with the pity he despised most, nor with the fear his men showed whenever he erupted. She was simply there, calm and patient, and that unsettled Dom more than any enemy he had ever faced. Gradually, Josie developed her own system of communication with Dom without anyone teaching her. She wrote notes in large, clear block letters on yellow paper and placed them wherever he needed. She created simple hand signals for basic needs like food, medication, rest, and calling Polly. She always stood directly facing him when she needed to communicate so he could read her lips, and she spoke slowly and clearly even though she knew he could not hear, because she believed that seeing someone speak to you with kindness was still better than people scribbling a few words and walking away. Meanwhile, Bianca appeared less and less in the mansion, claiming she was meeting Dom's social partners, attending charity events on his behalf, handling public relations for Caruso Holdings. But Josie noticed that every time Bianca left, she wore heavier makeup than usual, sprayed more expensive perfume than usual, and returned with bright eyes and a smile she never gave Dom. Josie did not know who Bianca was seeing, but the instincts of a woman who had lived with a liar told her it was not social business. Everything changed one afternoon as Josie was in the kitchen preparing dinner and Tommy was playing on the living room floor. The 2-year-old, with the lightning-fast mobility of a toddler, crawled down the hallway, pushed open the slightly ajar door to Dom's study, and slipped inside before Josie realized her child was gone. When Josie reached the study doorway, her heart nearly stopped because Tommy had climbed onto Dom's lap. The child stood on the mafia boss's thighs, both hands gripping the lapels of Dom's shirt face to face. Before Josie could rush in to pull him away, Tommy placed his tiny hands on both sides of Dom's face, the soft, warm palms covering the sharp cheekbones marked with small scars. And Tommy smiled, the pure, unguarded smile of a 2-year-old who did not yet know fear, did not know who the man in front of him was, only knew that every face deserved a smile. Dom froze completely. His hands hovered uselessly at his sides, not knowing where to go. Eyes wide, his entire body locked as if he had been shot, not from pain but because he could not remember the last time anyone had touched his face with such pure gentleness. Maybe it had been his mother 17 years earlier, and since then every hand that touched him had carried intention, desire, fear, or calculation. But these hands held nothing except the unconditional warmth of a child who did not yet know how cruel the world could be. Josie stood at the door with a hand over her mouth, afraid to breathe, wanting to rush in and grab her child, but her legs would not move because she was witnessing something no one else on earth might ever see. Dominic Caruso's eyes glistened red. Just for an instant, a moment so brief Josie would have missed it if she had blinked. Then he turned his face toward the window and clenched his jaw as if swallowing something he refused to let anyone see. He did not smile back at Tommy, but he did not push the child away either. And in Dom Caruso's world, not pushing someone away was already his way of saying they were allowed to stay. Josie stepped in quietly and lifted Tommy away, quickly writing on the board that she was sorry and the child had run too fast. Dom only waved a hand to signal it was fine before turning back to the window. But from that day on, every afternoon, Tommy found a way into Dom's study. Josie noticed that the door that had once always been shut now began to stay ajar, then cracked open, then a little wider each day, as if someone inside was silently inviting the child in without wanting to admit it out loud. Tommy sat on the floor beside the armchair playing with his teddy bear while Dom worked at the desk above him, the two of them sharing the same space without speaking a word, a mafia boss and a 2-year-old, each in his own world, yet somehow finding peace in the other's quiet presence. Then one evening, Josie found a brand new Fisher-Price building block set placed outside her door with no note attached. When she asked the butler, he shook his head and said he did not know. But the next morning, Josie accidentally saw a scrap of paper on Polly's desk as she passed the guard room. Dom's handwriting clearly written on it. "Buy toys for the kid, the good kind. Don't let his mother know I bought them." Josie turned away after reading it. For the first time since stepping into this house, she truly smiled because she understood that behind the steel walls Dominic Caruso had built over a lifetime, something was still alive. A 2-year-old with tiny hands had reached a place the rest of the world was too afraid to go. While Tommy was breaking down the invisible wall around Dom day by day with his smiles and tiny hands, on the other side of the Beacon Hill mansion, a completely different picture was becoming clearer than ever. Josie was the one who saw it most clearly, even though she told no one. Bianca Whitfield began abandoning all pretense of caring about Dom whenever only household staff were present. She never bothered to write notes to communicate with him. Even though Josie had placed whiteboards and markers in every room of the house, whenever Dom needed Bianca to explain something, she merely moved her lips quickly and then let out an exaggerated sigh when he signaled that he could not read her lips at that speed. That sigh weighed heavier than any words because it carried a message Dom could feel without needing to hear it. That she was bored, that she was tired of him, that she was sacrificing too much. Yet whenever guests came to the mansion, Bianca transformed into an entirely different person. She sat close beside Dom, holding his hand in front of business partners, eyes glistening as she spoke of sleepless nights caring for her fiancé, voice trembling as she said love had carried her through everything, and the guests nodded in admiration of her devotion, while Josie stood in the corner holding a tea tray, watching the scene with her stomach twisting, because she knew Bianca had not been home the night before. She had left in the evening and returned close to midnight, and that morning in the bathroom, she had forgotten a bottle of men's cologne Josie recognized as not belonging to Dom. Josie said nothing because it was not her place. She was only the housekeeper, but she saw the way Dom looked at Bianca whenever she performed, his eyes no longer warm as they once were, growing colder with each passing day, because even without hearing words, Dom could still read body language, and Bianca's body language was screaming that she had wanted to leave for a long time. Then Bianca began bringing financial documents for Dom to sign, thick stacks of papers with tiny print that she explained with only a few brief lines on the whiteboard, saying they were powers of attorney so she could manage Caruso Holdings while he recovered, that partners needed someone authorized to sign on his behalf, that everything would be easier if he trusted her to handle it. Dom read the explanations and looked at the documents. He did not sign, but did not outright refuse either. He simply wrote, "Let me review it," and placed them in the drawer. Josie saw Bianca leave the study with her jaw clenched and anger flashing in her eyes before she quickly masked it with her familiar smile upon seeing Josie in the hallway. Behind Dom's back, Bianca no longer bothered to hide it. Josie heard her on the phone with a friend right in the kitchen when she thought no one was paying attention, her voice sharp as she said she could not take another day, that Dom was now like a mute shadow sitting in a dark room, that she was sacrificing her youth for a man who had no value left beyond the money in his accounts, and that if it were not for a long-term plan, she would have left in the first week. Josie stood outside the kitchen, listening to every word, her hand clenched around the dishcloth. But she did not step in because she knew her place. She only turned away and wondered whether Dom knew what the woman he planned to marry truly thought of him. As Bianca disappeared from the mansion more often and for longer stretches, Josie quietly filled every gap Bianca left behind with small but consistent actions until they became the very breathing rhythm of the house. She memorized Dom's tastes in just 2 weeks. He liked black coffee with no sugar, brewed in an Italian mocha pot, and drank it in the morning before reading the paper. He ate his eggs fully cooked and never runny. He hated cilantro but liked fresh basil. He only ate pasta al dente and would not touch a plate if the noodles were too soft. She prepared his medication on time, placing it on the bedside table with a glass of warm water and a note reminding the dosage in large, clear letters. She reorganized his business schedule by writing summaries of each meeting on different colored papers: yellow for routine matters, pink for urgent ones, blue for things Polly needed to handle. And the system worked so well that Dom began processing work 3 times faster than in the early weeks when he was still struggling with chaotic communication. But what touched Dom most was not Josie's professionalism. It was the small notes she scattered throughout the house, like pinpoints of light in the dark. On the living room coffee table, a note that said, "The coffee is on the table. It's still hot." On his desk, one that read, "Tommy drew this for you. He says this is Mr. Dom." Attached to a crayon drawing by a 2-year-old that, if looked at closely, showed a big circle with 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a smiling mouth. On his pillow, after she tidied the room, a note that said, "Sleep well. Tomorrow will be better than today." Dom never responded to those notes, never wrote thank you, never nodded in acknowledgement. But Josie noticed he never threw them away. Every morning when she cleaned the study, she saw the previous day's notes neatly placed in the desk drawer instead of the trash. Tommy also began drawing pictures for Dom every day. The child sat on the study floor with a box of crayons, drawing images only a child's imagination could decipher, then ran over to place them on Dom's lap, and Dom accepted each one, looked at each one. then set it beside million-dollar business files, as if the crayon drawings of a 2-year-old mattered just as much as the numbers on paper. One evening, after Dom had gone upstairs and Josie was tidying the study for the last time that day, she opened the desk drawer to put away a pen and saw inside, arranged neatly and carefully, every drawing Tommy had ever made, every note Josie had ever left, not a single one missing, kept as carefully as if they were the most important documents in the entire Caruso Holdings empire. Josie stood there staring at that drawer for a long time, her chest tightening as she understood that in the silent and dark world Dom was living in, these small scraps of paper were the only things he had to hold on to. The man Boston called a devil was quietly collecting every clumsy crayon line drawn by her son as if they were priceless treasures. Since discovering the drawer filled with Tommy's drawings and her own notes in Dom's desk, Josie realized that this man was not as cold as he wanted the world to believe. But she kept that discovery to herself and continued her daily work as if nothing had changed, because she understood that Dom Caruso was the kind of man who would slam every door shut if he knew someone had seen him vulnerable. Late nights in the Beacon Hill mansion had a rhythm of their own that only Josie and Dom seemed to know. Bianca always went upstairs at 10 and slept soundly until morning, as if this house were a 5-star hotel she stayed in for free. But Dom barely slept at all. He often sat in the dim living room staring out the large east-facing window at the Boston lights flickering below Beacon Hill. Josie knew this because every morning when she cleaned the living room, she found the indentation in the armchair cushion by the window and the half-finished glass of whiskey on the table. Silent traces of a man wrestling with the darkness in his head through the long night. Josie did not sleep much either. She waited until Tommy was deeply asleep, then got up to do a final check of the house, ran another load of laundry, prepared breakfast for the next day, and every night she sat at the small kitchen table under the dim yellow light, dealing with paperwork she had no time to face during the day, because she was busy caring for Dom and Tommy. One night she sat at the kitchen table in the middle of the night. In front of her was an envelope from the skilled nursing facility where her mother was staying. She had held that envelope since the afternoon but had not dared to open it because she knew what was inside. When she finally tore it open and read it, it was exactly what she feared. A notice stating that the care bill for Carmen Reyes was overdue by 2 months and 17 days, and that if full payment was not made within the next 7 days, the facility would be forced to transfer her to a basic Medicaid program at a public nursing home on the outskirts of the city. A place Josie knew all too well because she had visited it when first searching for care for her mother. 4 patients to a room, overwhelmed staff, patients left lying for hours without being repositioned, and her mother with a right leg amputated above the knee, needing daily wound care, would not survive in a place like that. Josie finished reading the letter, set it down on the table, and her hands began to shake. Then her shoulders started to tremble. Then tears spilled freely despite her biting her lip until it bled, because she had already calculated everything. Her new salary at the Caruso house was 5 times her old pay, but still not enough to cover the 2 months of overdue bills plus the current month. She needed at least 3 months to save enough, but her mother only had 7 days. Josie cried in the kitchen in the middle of the night, not because she was weak, but because she had been strong for too long, and tonight her body refused to be strong for even 1 more second. She did not hear footsteps because Dom moved quietly, even in his own home, the habit of a mafia boss who had lived his entire life on alert. He came down to the kitchen for water as he did every sleepless night and stopped in the doorway when he saw Josie there, her back curved inward, shoulders shaking, face buried in her hands. Under the dim yellow light, she looked smaller than ever, and on the table in front of her lay the letter that Dom could not read from this distance, but whose medical facility logo he recognized at the top. Josie looked up when she sensed the change in light from the hallway and saw Dom standing in the kitchen doorway. She hastily wiped her tears with the back of her hand, forced a smile they both knew was false, then reached for the paper and pen on the table and quickly wrote, "Do you need anything? Shall I make tea?" and held it up for him to read. Because even in her deepest pain, Josie was still Josie, the person who asked what others needed before thinking of herself, the person who always hid her wounds behind a smile in the question, "How can I help you?" Dom read the words, then looked at her swollen red eyes, then at the letter on the table. He stood there longer than usual, longer than he had looked at anyone since losing his hearing, because in that moment he saw something he had never noticed before, that this woman was drowning too, carrying on her shoulders a weight heavy enough to crush anyone. Yet every morning she still woke early, still brewed his coffee, still wrote notes wishing him good night, still smiled at him as if her life held nothing to fear. Dom walked into the kitchen, pulled out a chair, sat across from Josie, took her paper, and wrote beneath her line in slow, deliberate letters, "Sit down, have tea with me," then slid the paper back across the table to her. Josie read those words, and her eyes filled again. But this time, not from pain, because it was the first time since she had entered this house that Dom had written something to her that was not an order, not a request, not an assignment, but an invitation, simple and more human than anything he had ever written. She stood to make 2 cups of tea, placed one in front of Dom, then sat across from him, and the two of them sat in the quiet kitchen in the middle of the night, saying nothing, because one could not hear, and the other did not know what to say, just drinking tea, just sitting there. But for the first time in this vast house of marble and original art and secrets, both Dom and Josie felt that they were not alone. And sometimes that was enough. After the night he drank tea in the kitchen with Josie, something inside Dom shifted, even though he never admitted it. He began coming down to the kitchen at the same hour every night, not because he was thirsty, but because he wanted to know whether she would be there. Yet Josie seemed to understand that night had been an exception, rather than a standing invitation. So she returned to her room earlier and sat alone in the empty kitchen, staring at the cup she usually used, without understanding why he felt disappointed. As Boston's winter slowly gave way to the damp chill of early spring, the impossible happened. Dom was sitting on the bed preparing to stand when he felt something in his right ear. Not the absolute silence he had grown accustomed to, but a low, muted hum, like a radio, turned far away. He froze on the bed, his heart pounding so hard he could feel the pulse in his neck, because he did not dare believe what he had just sensed. He sat perfectly still and waited, and the hum did not disappear but slowly grew clearer. Then, through that layer of noise, he heard something else, distant and thin like a strand of silk, yet unmistakably real. Tommy's laughter somewhere beyond the bedroom door, the giggling laugh of the child he had seen hundreds of times but never once heard. That sound pierced through the hum like sunlight breaking through thick clouds. Then the sound of birds outside the window. Then the wind. Then the soft footsteps of Josie passing along the hallway. The world returning to Dom layer by layer, slowly like fog dissolving under morning light, not rushing, but seeping back in. Dom sat on the bed gripping the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white, because he was afraid that if he moved, if he breathed too hard, everything would vanish and the silence would swallow him again. He remained like that for nearly an hour, listening to each sound return, as if counting drops of water in a desert. When he was certain this was not an illusion, that he truly could hear again, even if not perfectly, he took his phone and texted Dr. Harrison Webb only 3 words: "Come now. Urgent." Dr. Webb arrived at the mansion within 45 minutes, led upstairs by Polly to Dom's closed bedroom door. After examining him with the instruments he had brought, the doctor sat across from Dom with eyes wide in undisguised astonishment. He reached for the whiteboard out of habit, then stopped midway as he realized that for the first time he could speak directly, and he said softly, "Dom, can you hear me?" Dom nodded. "Doctor." Webb said that Dom's hearing had recovered to roughly 70% in his right ear and about 50% in his left, that the auditory nerves were regenerating at a pace medicine could only call a miracle because the case lay beyond all his expectations. If progress continued, then within a few weeks, Dom might recover almost completely. Dom listened to every word with ears that this same doctor had declared nearly permanently dead. Instead of rejoicing, instead of calling Bianca, instead of informing the household, the first instinct that rose in Dom was not that of a patient just healed, but that of a mafia boss who had survived 20 years in the underworld by never revealing his hand before the right moment. He looked straight into Dr. Webb's eyes and spoke in the low, deliberate voice the doctor had heard for 20 years serving the Caruso family, a voice that, when Dom used it, meant this was not a request but an order. No one is to know. Absolutely no one. Not Bianca, not Polly, not anyone inside or outside this house. You will write in the file that my condition is unchanged, still completely deaf. And if a single word leaves this room, then Harrison, our 20 years, will end immediately. Doctor. Webb swallowed, understanding that the last sentence was not an idle threat because Dominic Caruso never made idle threats. And he nodded his agreement to keep the secret even as concern stirred inside him because he did not understand why Dom would hide such good news. But Dom understood because in the time of deafness, he had learned the most expensive lesson of his life. When people believed he could not hear, they spoke the truth. And Dom wanted to hear the truth from everyone around him before letting them know he had his ears back. Information was the most powerful weapon in his world, and he had just acquired one. No enemy was prepared for the ability to hear every word spoken behind his back, while the entire world still believed he was stone deaf. That very night, when the mansion sank into silence and Bianca had long gone up to sleep, Dom lay in bed in the dark and for the first time actively listened instead of enduring silence. The first sound he heard clearly was not the city or the wind outside the window, but Tommy's voice down the hall calling, "Mama, Mama," asking to be held before sleep. Then Josie's gentle voice soothing the child, and then she began to sing a lullaby in Spanish, whose words Dom did not understand, but whose melody needed no translation, because it carried a language anyone could feel. Her voice warm, yet slightly laced with fatigue, sad yet so tender that each note felt like a hand placed against his chest, pressing lightly into a place he had believed long dead. Dom lay in the darkness listening to Josie sing Tommy to sleep through the thin wall separating their rooms. The song lasted a few minutes before fading as Tommy drifted off, followed by silence. But this silence was nothing like the silence of the past. It was no longer empty and cruel, but warm and full, as if the lullaby had filled the room with something Dom felt clearly in his chest, something slowly melting in the place where he had built walls all his life. He lay there long after the song ended, eyes open to the dark ceiling, trying to name the feeling spreading through him, but unable to find a word. Because Dominic Caruso knew the names of everything in his world, the names of fear, betrayal, power, loneliness. But this was something he had never touched before, and he had no word for it. The morning after he woke, Dom already had a plan. Not the plan of a patient newly recovering, but the plan of a boss setting pieces on a board his opponents did not yet know had been laid out. He left his room wearing the same familiar, empty expression, eyes regarding everyone as if he could not hear a thing, responding slowly to every interaction through whiteboards and written notes exactly as he had before. No one in the Beacon Hill mansion realized that Dom's ears were now capturing every sound, every breath, every whisper in this house, like a radar switched back on after a long shutdown. That afternoon, Dom sat in the living room armchair pretending to sleep, eyes half closed, a thin blanket draped across him, and Bianca walked past, glanced at him, then went straight into the kitchen without closing the door because she had grown accustomed to treating Dom like a piece of furniture without ears. She poured herself a glass of water and took out her phone to call someone she addressed as Babe, in a sweet voice she had not used with Dom since the day he was hospitalized. Then Bianca's tone changed from sweet to bitter as she began to complain, and every word cut cleanly through the quiet mansion straight into Dom's ears like a blade. She said she could not take it anymore, that he sat there all day like a corpse, that she had to write every word for him to read like teaching a child to spell, that he could not speak properly, could not hear anything, that she had to perform the role of a devoted fiancée in front of his men when it made her want to vomit, and that if it were not for the money, if it were not for our plan, she would have left long ago. She swore it. Dom lay motionless in the chair, eyes still closed, breathing even, but beneath the blanket his right hand clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white, and his nails dug into his palm deeply enough to leave marks, because he was listening to the woman whose engagement ring he had placed on her finger, the woman he had trusted enough to invite into his life, his home, his bed, calling him a corpse, and admitting that every tear, every smile, every hand held in front of guests had been an act. The words "our plan" echoed over and over in his mind because they confirmed what his instincts had long suspected, that Bianca was not alone. She had an ally. She had a plan. Dom needed to know who that ally was and what that plan entailed. He did not open his eyes, did not move, did not allow a single muscle in his face to betray the storm raging inside. Because Dominic Caruso had learned from his father that the moment you let your enemy know you are angry, you have already lost half the battle. That night, around 10, after Josie had taken Tommy back to their room and Bianca believed Dom had gone to bed, Dom heard the doorbell. Then Bianca opening the door and the voice of the man who stepped inside made the blood in Dom's veins turn cold for a beat, because he recognized it instantly despite the time of silence. The voice of Franco Duca, his former right hand, the man he had demoted for a serious mistake but kept in the organization because he believed Franco had learned his lesson. Now that voice was inside his house at night, speaking to his fiancée with an intimacy Dom did not need to see to know these two were not just allies, but lovers. Dom slipped out of his bedroom barefoot across the oak floor and down the spiral staircase, each step as light as a hunting cat, stopping in the darkness of the first-floor hallway, less than 10 steps from the living room, where Bianca and Franco sat on the sofa with 2 glasses of wine. Dom stood in the shadows, listening to every word with the patience of a hunter who had found his prey's den. Franco spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he held the advantage. He said that at Dom's birthday party, Bianca would invite all the major partners and a few friendly politicians. During the party, she would make an emotional speech and bring out the power of attorney documents, presenting them as a gift to officially help manage Caruso Holdings, that in front of everyone Dom could not refuse without losing face. Once he signed, everything would transfer to her name. She would pass control to Franco, slowly edge Dom out. He was deaf. He could not verify anything. In 2 or 3 months, everything would be theirs. Bianca asked, and for the first time her voice held real concern. What if he finds out he still has Polly and that lawyer Ashford? Franco laughed softly, a laugh filled with contempt that reached Dom's ears with brutal clarity. He said Dom was deaf, that he sat there all day staring out the window like a dead man, that he could not hear anything, did not know anything, and that once they controlled the holdings, even if Dom got his hearing back, it would not change a thing. Dom stood in the dark listening to that final sentence. The rage inside him did not erupt into fire like when he had thrown objects and slammed tables during the early period of deafness. No, this rage froze into ice, cold and hard and razor-sharp. The kind of anger his father had taught him was the most dangerous because it was not uncontrolled, but perfectly controlled. the kind that does not shout or smash or destroy, but sits down calmly, plans carefully, and waits for the exact moment to strike once and leave the enemy unable to rise again. Dom returned to his bedroom without a sound, lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling. In his mind, the battle map was already taking shape. The next morning, he wrote 2 separate notes maintaining his deaf facade. One to Polly saying to follow Franco Duca around the clock, record where he goes and who he meets, photograph everything. Do not let him know. Start today. One to Theodore Ashford, his attorney, saying to check every financial transaction under Bianca Whitfield's name over the past 6 months. Every account, every transfer, every credit card. Find it all and report back in writing. Tell no one. Polly took the note, read it, looked at Dom with cold, sharp eyes, then gave a single nod without asking a question because Polly did not need an explanation to understand that someone was about to pay a very heavy price. Theodore received his note the same day and began work immediately. Dom sat in his study watching Tommy play with building blocks on the floor, his face as calm as ever. But inside his head, the game had begun, and he would not make a single move until every piece his enemies held was exactly where he wanted it. Because Dominic Caruso did not take revenge hastily, he took revenge perfectly. While Polly and Theo quietly gathered evidence under Dom's orders, life inside the Beacon Hill mansion continued to flow normally on the surface, and Dom kept playing the role of the perfect deaf man so convincingly that no one suspected a thing. But beneath that mask, his ears were now absorbing everything like a sponge soaking up water. Every whisper, every sigh, every conversation people believed he could not hear was being recorded in his mind with the precision of a tape recorder. One morning, as Dom walked down the first-floor hallway toward his study, he heard Bianca's voice coming from the kitchen. He stopped behind the half-closed wooden door and realized Bianca was speaking to Josie, her tone dripping with the kind of fake sweetness Dom could now recognize from a distance, the way one senses poison mixed into wine. Bianca said she felt sorry for Josie. That day after day, she had to take care of a disabled man, writing notes all day, cleaning and serving him, that Josie was young and pretty and wasting her youth here, and she hoped Josie was not expecting anything from him beyond a paycheck because he no longer had the ability to give anyone anything. Dom behind the door listened as Bianca's gentle tone delivered words that pricked like tiny needles into flesh, not because she was insulting him, but because she was saying those things to Josie, the only woman in this house who had cared for him with a sincerity Bianca had never possessed. Bianca was trying to poison Josie by planting the idea that Dom was a burden, someone unworthy of hope. What happened next made Dom press a hand to the wall to steady himself because he was not prepared for it. Josie replied not with the silent endurance expected of a housekeeper speaking to the lady of the house, but with a calm, firm voice that did not tremble at all. She said Mr. Caruso was not disabled. He had lost his hearing, not his dignity. He was still the man who had built this entire empire with his own hands, that he still read every business document every day, still made decisions, and everyone in this house still followed them. With all due respect, Miss Whitfield, she was not working here because she expected anything from him. She worked here because he deserved to be treated with kindness, and she was able to do that. Silence followed for a few seconds, and Dom pictured Bianca's face, shifting from surprise to anger, because she was not used to being spoken back to by a housekeeper. Then he heard Bianca's heels strike the floor sharply as she stormed out of the kitchen, passing right by where he stood in the hallway without looking at him, too busy pursing her lips in fury, unaware that Dom stood less than 3 steps away, hearing every angry breath she took. After Bianca disappeared, Dom remained there a while longer because he needed time to process what he had just heard. Not Bianca's words, which had lost all weight with him after the night before, but Josie's. Because in 37 years of living, Dom had heard thousands of people talk about him, Underlings said he was great because they were afraid. Partners said he was brilliant because they needed his money. Bianca said he was perfect because she needed his bank accounts. But no one had ever spoken of him the way Josie just had. Not out of fear, not out of need, not out of desire, but simply because she believed it was true, that he was worthy, and she was willing to say it to the fiancé of a mafia boss, even though she was only a housekeeper who could be dismissed at any moment. Dom entered his study and sat down in his familiar armchair. Tommy looked up from playing on the floor and smiled at him. Dom looked at the child without really seeing him because Josie's words kept echoing in his head, that he deserved to be treated with kindness, spoken in that steady voice without hesitation. That night, Dom did not go down to the kitchen as usual, but stepped out onto the second-floor bedroom balcony, where he often sat looking over Boston, though tonight he was there for a different reason. His balcony sat directly above the window of Josie and Tommy's room in the rear wing below, and her window was slightly open because the night was warmer than usual. Early Boston spring air carried the scent of damp earth and wildflowers from the small garden behind the mansion. Dom sat on the balcony in the dark, silent, and he heard Josie's voice below, soothing Tommy to sleep, the child refusing to sleep and asking for a story. Josie began to speak to him in that warm whisper she used only when she thought no one was listening but Tommy. She said, "You know, Tommy, Mr. Dom looks very scary. He never smiles. He looks at everyone with such a cold gaze. All the men in the house are afraid of him." Tommy babbled something indistinct, and Josie laughed softly before continuing. "But he's much better than he thinks. He lets you play in his room all day without chasing you out. He buys toys for you and hides it so Mommy won't know, thinking Mommy doesn't notice. Today he even saved a piece of cake for you on the table." Her voice paused, then grew softer, almost just a breath. "Mommy wishes someone would tell him that he deserves to be loved. Tommy, whether he can hear it or not, whether he believes it or not, he deserves it." Dom sat on the cold balcony with his back against the brick wall, eyes lifted to the starless Boston sky hidden by clouds, jaw clenched so tightly his temples twitched as he used all his strength to keep his face from breaking, even though no one was watching. Because Dominic Caruso had built walls around himself for 20 years, since his mother died. He had taught himself that love was weakness, and weakness was death. He had lived his life believing people stayed because they were afraid or because they needed him, never because they wanted to. Tonight, a woman he paid to clean his house and cook his meals was whispering to her 2-year-old son in the small room below his feet that he deserved to be loved, not because he was rich, not because he was powerful, not because he could give her anything, but simply because she saw the real man behind the steel wall the rest of the world only saw as fear. Dom sat on that balcony long after Josie's voice faded and the lullaby ended and the mansion fell silent. He remained there until the air grew colder and night dew began to gather on the balcony railing. He did not cry because Dominic Caruso did not cry, but something inside his chest cracked open that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, silent fracture in the wall he had built his entire life. Through that fracture, for the first time in 37 years, light slipped in. In the days following the night on the balcony, Dom began to look at Josie differently, even though he showed no outward change. He continued to play the role of the perfect deaf man, still communicating with whiteboards, still nodding or waving a hand when she handed him notes. But inside, he had started noticing things he had never bothered to see before. The way Josie always brewed his coffee before making milk for Tommy. The way she adjusted the cushion on the armchair to the exact angle he liked to lean against. The way she cut Tommy's food into small pieces, with one hand while using the other to write a concise summary of his afternoon meetings. He wondered where all that strength came from in such a slender body. But one afternoon, that fragile calm in the mansion shattered when the doorbell rang over and over, followed by shouting that pierced through the wrought iron gate. A man's voice, rough with alcohol, roared outside. "Josie, I know you're in there. Open the gate. I'm here to take my kid. Tommy is my son, and you have no right to hide him." Dom looked out the window and saw a man in his early 30s outside the gate, hair unkempt, coat filthy, eyes bloodshot, hands gripping the iron bars and shaking them violently. Though Dom had never met Ryan Dutton, he knew instantly who it was because he had heard Josie speak of her past with Tommy during nights when she sang him to sleep. Small fragments whispered to the child without knowing Dom had been listening from the balcony above. Before Dom could react, the shouting reached the kitchen where Josie was giving Tommy his afternoon snack. Dom heard a plate shatter on the floor, Josie's sharp intake of breath like someone being choked, then Tommy's terrified screaming. When Dom stepped into the hallway, he saw Josie standing in the middle of the kitchen clutching Tommy, her face white as paper, eyes wide yet seeing nothing in front of her because she was looking inward into nights when Ryan punched her face, kicked her stomach, dragged her by the hair across the floor. The memories of abuse crashed back like a broken dam, and her body shook so hard that Tommy had to wrap both arms around her neck to keep from falling. Polly reacted fastest, reaching the gate within half a minute, one hand grabbing Ryan by the collar and yanking him away from the bars. But Ryan was drunk enough to be reckless. He swung a punch that missed Polly and staggered, shouting louder, "I have rights! My lawyer said I have visitation rights. I'll sue. I'll take Tommy. I'll drag you to court. Do you hear me, Josie?" Polly pushed him farther from the gate with one hand without effort, because Ryan could barely stand, but his shouting still carried into the house, and Tommy's crying grew louder as he clung tighter to his mother. Josie stood in the kitchen trembling, her knees buckling so she had to brace herself against the counter, because Ryan's threat to take Tommy was the greatest fear of her life, greater than the fear of being beaten, greater than hunger, because losing Tommy meant losing the only reason she still breathed each day. Dom stood at the kitchen doorway watching Josie shake as she held Tommy. He heard everything, Ryan outside, Tommy crying, Josie's ragged breathing, but he had to keep his face blank because he was still pretending to be deaf, so he walked toward Josie slowly and placed a hand on her shoulder with the same gentle pressure she had used on his the first day they met. She looked up at him with eyes flooded with tears. Then she set Tommy on a chair and took the whiteboard, writing with hands shaking so badly the letters slanted and wobbled. "I'm sorry. I'll pack and leave right away. I'm sorry for bringing this into your house." Dom read the words and something clenched inside his chest because he saw in Josie's eyes not only fear of Ryan, but fear of being sent away. Fear of losing the only warm place she and Tommy had. Fear of returning to the cracked wall studio with a broken heater and an empty refrigerator. She was apologizing to him for the man outside attacking her as if it were her fault, as if being abused were something she should be ashamed of. Dom took the marker and erased her words, then wrote slowly in large, clear letters, making sure she would miss nothing. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home." He pushed the board back to her, meeting her eyes with a look she had never seen from him before. Not the cold gaze he used on everyone else, but one that was firm, unmistakable, and allowed no argument. A look that said this was not empty comfort, but a declaration from Dominic Caruso. When Dominic Caruso said this was her home, the whole world could knock at the gate, and no one would get through. Josie read the sentence, then read it again and again. Tears spilled down her face. But these were different tears, not of fear, but of a woman who had run for 3 years, slept in shelters, skipped meals so her child could have milk, faced threatening letters from lawyers alone, and for the first time in all those long years, someone had stood between her and her fear and said, "You're not going anywhere." After Josie carried Tommy back to their room, Dom turned to Polly, who had just come in from the gate, and wrote a note in handwriting sharper than usual. "Ryan Dutton. Find everything on him. Records, debts, warrants, restraining orders, everything. Report back tonight." Polly read it, looked at Dom, and nodded once. If Ryan Dutton had seen the look shared between those two men, he would have fled Boston that very night instead of waiting until it was far too late. That night in the small rear wing room, Tommy clung to Josie even in sleep, his arms locked around her neck as if afraid someone might take her away. Josie sat on the bed holding him, back against the wall, unable to sleep, staring into the dark. But on her lap was the whiteboard she had brought from the living room, and the words Dom had written were still there. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home." She held Tommy with one arm while the other rested on those words, as if by touching them long enough she could make them true. The next morning, when Josie woke with Tommy still clinging to her neck and Dom's words still written on the whiteboard beside the bed, Dom had already been sitting in his first-floor office since early reading the report Polly had left on his desk at midnight. 3 handwritten pages dense with information about Ryan Dutton that Polly had gathered in only a few hours through the network the Caruso family had built over 20 years. A network that, when needed, could find out how many times anyone on the East Coast sneezed in a day. Ryan Dutton, 30 years old, prior domestic violence charges in Brockton, violation of a restraining order Josie had obtained when she fled him, 2 years of unpaid federal taxes, and most importantly, an active warrant in Connecticut for aggravated assault against another woman after Josie, which meant he had not only beaten Josie, he had continued beating other women. This time, the victim had been hospitalized. When Dom read that detail, his hand clenched hard enough to crumple the edge of the paper because he thought of that same hand striking Josie's 6-month pregnant belly and the possibility that one day it could touch Tommy. Dom wrote a note to Theodore Ashford immediately, short and cold. "Ryan Dutton showed up outside my estate yesterday. Security cameras recorded everything. He violated a restraining order, has an active Connecticut warrant, and unpaid federal taxes. I want him gone from Josie Reyes' life within 48 hours. Use the law. Clean. No trace back to me." Theo received the note in the morning and went to work at once, filing a restraining order violation with Boston police, along with copies of the Beacon Hill estate security footage, contacting the U.S. Marshals to report Ryan Dutton's current location tied to the Connecticut warrant, and forwarding the tax file to the IRS because Theodore Ashford was the kind of lawyer who did not open one door when he could open 3. 48 hours later, Ryan Dutton was arrested by U.S. Marshals in a cheap bar in Quincy, where he was drunk telling his buddies he was about to sue for his son. He was handcuffed and extradited to Connecticut to face aggravated assault charges, along with additional charges for restraining order violations in Massachusetts and federal tax evasion, enough to keep him from seeing free daylight for a very long time. Josie learned Ryan had been arrested through a call from a domestic violence victim advocacy office on the 3rd day, the woman on the line telling her Ryan Dutton had been taken into custody and was awaiting trial in Connecticut, that the restraining order had been extended, that she and her son were safe. Josie set the phone down and sank onto the kitchen floor with her hands over her face, but she did not cry. She just breathed. Deep, slow breaths like someone surfacing after being held underwater for 3 years. Because for the first time since the night she fled the Brockton apartment 6 months pregnant and bruised, Ryan was truly gone from her life. Not because he chose to leave, but because he was forced to. She did not know why. She thought it was luck. She thought it was mercy. She did not know that behind a wall Dom was sitting in his office, listening to the sound of her relief and nodding once to himself, because this was how Dominic Caruso protected his own. Quietly, without fingerprints, only results. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Josie slept straight through without jolting awake at every sound. Tommy slept better too, because children feel when their mothers are less afraid, and the Beacon Hill mansion had a rare, peaceful night. But that peace lasted only a few days. One night, the largest snowstorm of the winter slammed into Boston, wind howling hard enough to shake the mansion windows, snow falling so thick the streets turned into white rivers, and the city nearly shut down. In the middle of the night, Dom lay in bed listening to the storm when he heard the sound that froze his blood. Tommy crying, but not his usual call for his mother. It was weak, broken, a whimper of pain, followed by Josie calling his name in a voice Dom recognized instantly as panic. "Tommy, Tommy, Mommy's here, open your eyes, Tommy." Dom leapt from bed but stopped at his door because he had to maintain the cover. He could not run down like someone who heard everything. So he waited a short time, then walked down the stairs as if he had woken to the lights. When he reached Josie's room, he saw her kneeling on the floor holding Tommy, the child flushed with fever, eyes clenched shut, small body convulsing. Josie holding him with one arm while fumbling her phone with the other, fingers shaking so badly she dialed 911 wrong twice. Tears spilling onto Tommy's face as she told the dispatcher her son was seizing and needed an ambulance, only to be told that in the storm conditions response would take at least 30 minutes. Josie screamed that her son did not have 30 minutes. Dom watched for a few seconds, then turned and ran to his office, grabbed the whiteboard and wrote faster than he ever had. "Call Dr. Webb to the house now. Emergency. Child fever. Seizure." He shoved it into Polly's hands in the hallway. Already awake from the noise, Polly read it and called Dr. Webb immediately. The doctor, living less than 2 kilometers away on Beacon Hill, drove through the storm and arrived in 15 minutes with his medical kit. The sight that greeted him was the personal physician of Boston's most powerful mafia boss, kneeling on the floor of a small rear wing room during the worst snowstorm of the winter, treating the 2-year-old son of the housekeeper. Dr. Webb examined Tommy quickly, diagnosed a high fever from a middle ear infection causing febrile seizures, administered medication and antibiotics, and after 40 minutes, Tommy's fever dropped. The convulsion stopped, his breathing evened out, eyes still closed but face relaxed, small hand curling around his mother's finger in sleep. Josie knelt by the bed after Dr. Webb left, both hands clasping Tommy's tiny hand against her cheek. She cried soundless sobs, shoulders shaking without a sound, because she had learned to cry quietly in shelters so as not to wake anyone, tears soaking into the hand of the child sleeping peacefully. Dom stood in the doorway watching. He had been there throughout the examination and had not left. When it was over, he stepped into the room slowly, went to where Josie knelt, and placed his right hand on her left shoulder. No writing, no signals. Just his hand there, with her in the small room where a child had just survived a crisis. The storm still raging outside, but inside only Tommy's soft breathing and the silent presence of 2 adults standing together. Josie did not look up, did not write anything. She simply lifted her left hand and placed it gently over Dom's hand on her shoulder. They stood like that a long time in silence, her small cold hand resting on his large warm one. Nothing needed to be said because there are moments when language written or spoken is unnecessary, and this was one of them. After that night of the snowstorm, something shifted inside the Beacon Hill mansion that no one named aloud but everyone felt. Even Polly, the quietest man in the house, noticed that his boss no longer ate breakfast alone behind the closed door of his office, but began coming down to the kitchen to sit at the table where Josie fed Tommy. Dom taking the seat at the head opposite her with a cup of black coffee she had already prepared exactly the way he liked it, while Tommy sat in his high chair between them, smearing oatmeal over his face, his hands, and the tray. Dom watched the messy child with the corner of his mouth twitching into something almost like a smile, though it never fully became one. Josie saw it but pretended she had not, because she understood that if she reacted, Dom would shut himself down immediately. So she simply set another slice of toast in front of him and turned to wipe oatmeal from Tommy's cheeks as if the most feared man in Boston eating breakfast with a housekeeper and her child were the most normal thing in the world. The shared breakfasts became a habit no one announced and no one broke. Every morning Dom came down, Josie had 3 places set. Tommy was the only one who talked nonstop, babbling nonsense no one understood. Yet those meaningless sounds somehow filled the silence between two adults who could not speak to each other freely because one was pretending not to hear and the other did not dare say more than she should. Then, one afternoon, when Josie carried a tray of tea into Dom's office as usual, she stopped short in the doorway and nearly dropped it because the sight before her branded itself into her memory forever. Tommy asleep on Dom's chest, the child's head tucked neatly beneath Dom's chin, one of Dom's arms curved around Tommy's back to keep him from slipping, while his other hand held a pen marking notes on a stack of business documents spread across the desk. Dom working one-handed because the other was devoted to holding a sleeping 2-year-old against his chest. What made Josie's chest tighten was not the act itself, but how natural it looked, as if Dom had held Tommy like that many times before, without her knowing, as if his body had already memorized the weight of the child well enough to know exactly where to place his hand without looking. Josie stood there with tears in her eyes, set the tray down on the small table in the hallway instead of entering, then turned away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand before returning to the kitchen to continue working as if nothing had happened, even though inside her everything was shifting in ways she refused to name. That same week, Dom wrote a note to Theodore Ashford that made the lawyer read it twice to be sure he understood it correctly. Find the best skilled nursing facility in Boston for a lower limb amputee with diabetic complications. Transfer Carmen Reyes from her current facility. Pay all outstanding and future costs. Set up automatic monthly payments. List the payer as an anonymous charitable fund supporting immigrant families. Do not allow the Caruso name to appear anywhere, and do not let Josie Reyes know I am involved. Theo completed it within 3 days. Carmen Reyes was transferred from the overcrowded low-cost facility, where she shared a room with 3 other patients, to Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital, one of the best rehabilitation centers in the country. A private room with a harbor view, a specialized diabetic care team, all outstanding bills paid in full. Josie received the call from Spalding at midday, informing her that her mother had been transferred under the support of an anonymous charitable foundation, and that all expenses had been covered. She stood in the mansion hallway with the phone shaking in her hand before sinking to her knees on the marble floor and sobbing openly, unable to understand where this miracle had come from, or who had done this, or why someone would help her mother without ever showing their face. She cried from relief and gratitude because for months she had lived in constant fear of losing her mother at any moment, and now that fear had vanished, as if someone had quietly lifted the stone from her chest without letting her see the hand that did it. Dom sat in his office listening to Josie's sobs through the open door. He did not go out, did not write a note, did not do anything at all. He simply sat there and listened, and knew that this time her tears were not from pain, but from healing. That was enough. But the hardest part was not helping Josie from the shadows. It was maintaining distance when she was near, because each day Dom realized he searched for her with his eyes more often, realized he listened to her lullabies every night and did not want them to end, realized he looked forward to breakfast not for the coffee, but for the minutes across from her. Then one night, the second winter storm of the month hit Boston, and the power in the mansion went out at 11. Darkness swallowed the house from basement to roof. The backup generator failed to start after never being repaired from the last storm. Tommy screamed in terror at the sudden dark, and Josie scooped him up and ran down the stairs through pitch-black hallways because her room was in the detached rear wing, and she was afraid to stay there alone with a panicking child. She turned into the main hall and collided hard with Dom, who was moving in the opposite direction because he, too, had come downstairs at the sound of Tommy's cries, though he would later pretend he had only come down because he felt the house shudder when the power failed. Josie crashed into Dom's chest, and he caught her instinctively, one hand bracing her back, the other her shoulder. Tommy pressed between them, still crying but already quieter, soothed by the solid presence of adult bodies around him. In the total darkness, the three of them stood so close that Dom could feel Josie's uneven breath against his neck, smell the faint scent of the cheap soap she used carried by the cold air. A scent nothing like Bianca's expensive perfume, yet one that made Dom's chest tighten in a way no perfume ever had. Tommy's cries faded to hiccups, then sniffles, then silence, leaving only the sound of their breathing in the dark and the storm raging outside. Slowly, Dom lifted his right hand from Josie's shoulder, moving it toward her face, unable to see but guided by the warmth of her skin as his fingers neared, stopping less than a centimeter from her cheek, and he froze, stopping mid-motion like a man jolted awake from a dream because he remembered who he was, who she was, Tommy between them, Bianca asleep upstairs, that Josie was his employee, and that everything between them rested on a lie he was not ready to dismantle. So he stepped back. Josie stepped back too quickly, like someone pulling away from fire. In the darkness, they stood a single step apart, a distance that felt as wide as an ocean, unable to see each other's faces, yet both fully aware of what had nearly happened between a mafia boss and a housekeeper in a dark living room at night. Both of them afraid not of each other, but of the thing growing between them, something neither of them had the right to touch, and neither of them knew how to stop. After that blackout night, Dom and Josie never spoke of what had happened in the darkness of the living room. The next morning, they ate breakfast with Tommy as usual. Josie set Dom's coffee in front of him and turned to wipe oatmeal from Tommy's face, without looking at Dom for more than a second. Dom held his cup and stared out the window as if the night before had never existed. Yet both of them knew that stepping back in the dark had not erased what almost happened. It had only postponed it. Still, Dom did not have time to dwell on Josie because on the other side of the battlefield, Franco Duca was accelerating his move, and now Dom's ears were taking in everything. That afternoon, while Dom pretended to sleep in his office with the door closed, he heard through the ventilation system connecting his office to the adjacent sitting room on the first floor, Franco speaking with two lower-level men, whose voices Dom recognized instantly, men he had fed and clothed since they were dock kids running errands at South Boston Harbor, now sitting in his house while Franco reassigned control of port shipping routes as if Dom were already dead. Franco spoke with the confidence of a man who believed himself the new boss, saying, "Caruso is finished. He is deaf. He is weak. He trusts me. Conley Terminal and Flynn Cruise Port move to my control next month. The Teamsters' local boys answer to me now. I have locked in the Port Authority connections too. In 2 months, everything is ours." He signs the power of attorney at his birthday party in front of all the partners and politicians. Bianca will handle that. He cannot refuse in front of 100 people without losing face. Once he signs, it does not matter if he ever hears again because there will be nothing left to hear. Dom lay motionless in the armchair, listening to every word. If Franco had seen Dom's eyes beneath those half-closed lids, he would have seen cold steel flashing, the gaze of a boss not cornered, but calmly counting each exposed pawn on the board. But Franco was not the only threat, because Bianca was playing her own game, and her next target was not Dom but Josie, because Bianca was smart enough to see that the housekeeper's growing importance in the household endangered her plan. That evening, while Josie was cleaning the main living room, Bianca entered with a face already prepared for theater. She walked straight to the display shelf holding the antique Chinese vase Dom had once said was worth over $200,000. As she passed, she deliberately swept her hand so the vase fell to the marble floor and shattered. Then she turned to Josie with wide fake eyes and a voice loud enough to echo across the first floor. "Josie, you just broke Dom's antique vase. My God, that vase was incredibly expensive. He's going to be furious." Josie froze with the cleaning cloth in her hand, staring at the shards on the floor, and then at Bianca, knowing she had not touched the vase because she had been standing at least 3 steps away, but also knowing that her word against the boss's fiancé was worth nothing. So she silently knelt to collect the fragments. Bianca did not stop. She wrote on the whiteboard and handed it to Dom when he came into the hall after Polly signaled him about the noise. "Josie broke your antique vase. I think her pay should be docked, and maybe we need someone more careful." Dom read the words and knew Josie had not broken the vase because he had clearly heard Bianca's heels pass the shelf and the deliberate sweep of her arm before it fell. But he could not say, "I heard you push it." So he simply erased Bianca's message and wrote 7 words back: "Josie stays. End of discussion." Then he met Bianca's eyes with a look she had seen often enough to know the conversation was over. Bianca walked away, heels cracking against the marble like small gunshots. Dom watched her disappear down the hall before turning to see Josie kneeling on the floor gathering shards, a small cut bleeding on her hand from the sharp porcelain. Yet she did not stop. Dom wanted to tell her he knew the truth, but he could not. Not yet. So he turned and went back into his office and wrote 2 final notes, one to Polly. "Final report on Franco and Bianca. All evidence on my desk before the party." One to Theo. "Prepare everything for my birthday party, including full legal documentation of every illegal transaction by Franco Duca and Bianca Whitfield. Printed clearly enough for everyone in the room to read. I do not want a single dollar missing." Dom set down the pen and looked out the window as the Boston afternoon light faded. On the floor, Tommy slept curled around his worn teddy bear. Dom looked at the child, then at the city spread below Beacon Hill, every piece now positioned exactly where he wanted it. Franco thinking he was winning, Bianca thinking Dom could not hear a thing. Both of them stepping confidently into a trap without knowing the man who said it had been waiting patiently all along. Dominic Caruso allowed himself to smile for the first time in months, unseen by anyone except the sleeping child at his feet. In the weeks leading up to the birthday party, the Beacon Hill mansion began transforming under Bianca's direction. She hired the most expensive event planning company in Boston to dress the house from the front hall to the rear garden. Fresh flowers flown in from the Netherlands, crystal lighting rented from New York, a menu designed exclusively by a Michelin-starred chef, all of it charged to Caruso Holdings. Bianca approved every invoice without asking Dom because she considered it her right as his fiancée. Dom heard every call, every number, and let her spend because every dollar she spent became another line in the indictment Theo was compiling. On the day of the party, Josie woke early as always, but today there was more to prepare. She helped the kitchen staff arrange the food, checked tables and chairs, made sure everything for Dom was set exactly where it needed to be. Then in the afternoon, she returned to the small rear wing room to shower and put on the black and white service uniform Bianca had chosen for her. A white buttoned shirt, short black vest, black trousers, a white apron tied at the waist. Josie stood in the small bathroom mirror for a long time, not because she thought she looked bad, but because she saw more clearly than ever who she was in this house. A server, a tray bearer, someone invisible among the glittering crowd about to flood the first-floor living room. Even though Dom had said, "This is your home," tonight she would stand in the corner while Bianca stood beside him in front of everyone. That was her place. Josie knew it. She only wished it did not hurt so much. Tommy clung to her leg when she was about to leave, the 2-year-old sensing something different, though he did not know why. Josie knelt to his level, kissed his forehead, whispered for him to be good, told him she would be just downstairs, that Uncle Paulie would watch him tonight. Tommy looked at her with wide eyes and nodded, even though he clearly did not understand. Then Paulie lifted Tommy with the gentle awkwardness of a 45-year-old man who had never had children, but had somehow come to love this little boy, and Josie stepped out and closed the door behind her. In the evening, the guests began arriving. The Beacon Hill mansion glowed like a palace on the hill, luxury cars lining the narrow cobblestone street, couples passing through the wrought iron gate in expensive suits and evening gowns. Nearly every Caruso Holdings partner present, because no one dared be absent, even knowing the boss was deaf. 2 state senators and 1 Boston city councilor arriving with practiced political smiles. Regina Palmer, wife of federal Senator Palmer, entering in a deep blue gown on her husband's arm, surveying the mansion with sharp eyes accustomed to every variety of Boston elite display. Franco Duca arrived in a newly tailored suit with the posture of a man who already saw himself as the next boss, shaking hands with confident brilliance, eyes sweeping the room like an inventory of assets about to be his. When his gaze met Bianca's across the room, they exchanged a fleeting smile. No one else noticed, except Dom, seated in the central armchair staring forward with the blank expression of a deaf man unaware of what was happening around him, while behind those eyes the boss was counting down the minutes. Josie stood in the left corner by the drinks table with a champagne tray, moving through the crowd like a ghost. Unseen, unspoken to, unacknowledged. Nothing more than hands offering glasses and a nod before retreating, invisible among the luxury. Josie accepted it because she had been invisible long before she ever came to this house. Around 8, when the party reached its peak, Bianca stepped forward to the small microphone stand in the living room, wearing a red gown hugging her perfect figure, blonde hair and soft waves, flawless makeup. She began speaking in a trembling, emotional voice that Dom now heard clearly, recognizing every pause, every catch in her throat as precisely calculated, like a rehearsed script, saying the past months had been the hardest time of her life, watching the man she loved lose his hearing, watching him struggle daily with silence, nights when she cried alone, not knowing how to help him. Tears slid down Bianca's cheeks on cue, her voice breaking at exactly the right moments. A few guests visibly moved. Regina Palmer watched with a measured gaze but remained silent. Bianca continued that tonight she wanted to give Dom a special birthday gift, that she wished to officially step in to help manage Caruso Holdings so he could focus on recovery, that this was the power of attorney prepared by lawyers, and that she hoped he trusted her as she had always trusted him. She placed the thick document set before Dom along with a Mont Blanc pen, smiled sweetly at him, then turned to the crowd with a modest nod. Franco stood 3 steps behind with eyes blazing like a man about to touch treasure. The entire room fell utterly silent as nearly 100 pairs of eyes fixed on the man in the armchair. His cast removed, but arms still weak, the scar on his forehead healed but visible. The pen waited for him to pick it up and sign away his empire to the woman who had called him a corpse behind his back and the man who had declared him finished. Josie stood in the corner gripping her tray chest tight, not knowing what Dom would do, but knowing something immense was about to happen, because she had lived long enough in this house to recognize that Dominic Caruso was never cornered. The silence stretched as Dom slowly looked down at the papers, at the pen, then lifted his gaze to Bianca, the entire room holding its breath in anticipation. The silence stretched for seconds. Bianca standing beside him with a smile frozen on her lips, beginning to tremble at the corners because the pause had gone far longer than the script she had rehearsed. Franco behind her swallowing hard, and Josie in the corner gripping the champagne tray so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Then Dom moved. He did not pick up the pen. He placed both hands on the arms of the chair and rose slowly, every motion deliberate like a predator stretching before the strike, standing straight before nearly 100 of the most powerful people in Boston. With a calm, decisive motion, he pushed the power of attorney papers aside as if brushing a fly from the table. Bianca opened her mouth to speak, but before a sound emerged, Dom spoke first, and when his voice carried through the room, it felt like thunder under a clear sky, low and steady and unmistakably audible. A voice nearly everyone there had believed they would never hear again. Each word fell heavy as a hammer onto an anvil in absolute silence as he said that he could hear everything. The room froze. A few people gasped. A glass shattered somewhere in a corner, but no one turned because no one could look away from Dom. He continued, his voice never rising, still slow, still calm, in a way that chilled the blood, saying that he heard every phone call, every conversation behind his back, every plan, every whisper they thought he could not hear. From beginning to end, Bianca went pale, the color draining from her perfectly made-up face so fast the foundation looked absurd on her chalk-white skin, her red lips parting without sound. For the first time in her life, Bianca Whitfield had no script to perform because she had never practiced for this moment. Franco stepped back, survival instinct moving his feet before his mind could catch up, because he had lived long enough in the underworld to know that when Dom Caruso spoke in that tone, someone was about to lose something forever. Dom turned his gaze to Franco, and there was no uncontrolled rage there, only ice, cold and sharp and certain. As he said that Franco thought he was deaf, so he thought he was stupid, that he heard Franco sitting in his living room saying Caruso was finished, that he heard him dividing the Conley Terminal and Flynn Cruiseport routes, that he heard him say that in 2 months everything would belong to him. Franco tried to speak, but Dom had already turned to Bianca and said that she called him a corpse, that she said she had to write for him like teaching a child, that she said if it were not for the money, she would have left long ago. Dom's voice dropped another register, almost a whisper. Yet in the dead silent room, every word carried to every corner as he said, "Fine, then go." He nodded once to Polly, and the ballroom doors opened. 2 of Dom's loyal men entered with thick files in their hands, walking straight to Franco and Bianca and laying the folders on the table before the entire room. Inside them, everything Polly and Theo had gathered over weeks, photographs of Franco and Bianca together at restaurants, at hotels, at an apartment Franco had secretly rented, printed messages between them, copies of money transfers from Caruso Holdings accounts into Bianca's name totaling over $700,000, records of Franco secretly signing port contracts without Dom's approval, all laid out clearly, enough evidence for a federal criminal case. Franco stared at the evidence, then at Dom. For the first time in his life, he felt real fear because he realized Dom had not just been hearing. He had been hearing for a long time and had let Franco walk into the trap unaware. Dom looked at Franco and said one sentence, his voice low and light as breath. Franco had 24 hours to leave Boston. If after 24 hours Dom heard his name anywhere in the city, Franco knew what would happen. The room trembled, not because Dom shouted, but because he did not. Because when Dominic Caruso whispered that was when he was most dangerous. Bianca collapsed, sobbing, the tears this time real, kneeling on the marble floor with her red dress spread around her like a pool of blood, begging, pleading, calling Dom's name. But he did not look at her. She had ceased to exist in his world the moment he heard her call him a burden. She would never reclaim that place. Polly escorted Franco and Bianca from the ballroom, Franco walking with head bowed and face drained, Bianca with mascara streaked black down her cheeks and her crying echoing down the hallway until the front doors closed behind them. Then Dom did something no one in that room expected. He did not return to his seat. He did not address the crowd. He did not explain or justify. He walked straight through nearly 100 people standing frozen, past senators and business partners and politicians, past Regina Palmer staring wide-eyed, and went directly to the left corner, where Josie stood motionless with the champagne tray in her hands, her eyes wide, lips trembling, tears running down her cheeks. She did not wipe away because her hands were full, having witnessed everything from start to finish and shaking because she did not understand how Dom could hear or why he was coming toward her. Dom stopped before her, gently took the champagne tray from her hands and set it on a nearby table, and for the first time spoke directly to her with his voice instead of a whiteboard, saying that he heard her sing to Tommy every night outside his door, that he heard her tell Tommy he deserved to be loved, that he heard her defend him to Bianca when she thought he could not hear anything. Josie cried, shaking her head, stepping back until her shoulders touched the wall, her voice breaking as she said she was just a maid and did not have the right. But Dom stepped forward, closing the distance she had created, and said in the same low voice, this time, not the boss's voice, but the voice of a man standing before the only woman who had truly seen him, that she was the only one who told him the truth when the whole world lied, the only one who saw him when he thought he had disappeared. Then he took her hand, the large, rough hand of a mafia boss closing around the small, cracked hand of a housekeeper worn by cleaning, before nearly 100 of the most powerful people in Boston, standing stunned. It was not a declaration of love, but a proclamation, the strongest Dominic Caruso had ever made, stronger than any multi-million-dollar contract, stronger than any command or whispered threat. Because tonight, the mafia boss held a housekeeper's hand before his entire world and said without words that she was the most important person there. The silence held until Regina Palmer, the sharpest woman in Boston high society, whose word carried the weight of a Senate resolution, set down her glass and crossed the room to Josie, offering her hand, with the first warm smile Josie had received from the elite since entering this house, and said loudly enough for the entire room to hear that any woman who could make Dominic Caruso find his voice again deserved to stand wherever she chose. That night, after the last guest had left the mansion and Polly closed the wrought iron gate for the final time, Josie stood in the small auxiliary room holding Tommy asleep against her shoulder and looked down at her right hand, the hand Dom had held before nearly 100 people, still feeling the warmth of his palm on her skin. That frightened her more than anything Ryan Dutton had ever done, because Ryan had made her fear pain, while Dominic Caruso was making her fear hope. Josie knew hope was the most dangerous thing for someone who had grown used to loss. The next morning, when Dom came down to the kitchen and sat in his usual place waiting for breakfast, Josie set the coffee cup in front of him, but did not sit across from him as she did every day. Instead, she stood on the other side of the table with her hand gripping the chair back. She spoke in a voice she had practiced all night to keep from trembling, telling him she was grateful for everything he had done, but that she could not, that the distance between them was too great, that he controlled half this city while she cleaned his house, that if she stood beside him, Boston high society would laugh at him and the underworld would see her and Tommy as a weakness to attack him. She could not let her son live in that danger. Dom listened to every word, the coffee steaming in front of him, Tommy babbling on the floor with his teddy bear. When Josie finished, Dom was silent for a long time before lifting his eyes to her. Not the cold gaze he used on Franco, and not the empty look he wore when pretending to be deaf, but the eyes of a man looking at the one thing in his life he was afraid to lose. He said slowly that he was not asking her to love him. He was asking her not to leave. Josie bit her lip and turned away, because she knew if she looked at him for one more second, she would not have the strength to say no. So she only shook her head and carried Tommy out of the kitchen. All day she avoided Dom, working in silence, leaving notes on the desk instead of handing them to him. Dom did not follow or push or ask again, because he understood she was not refusing because she did not want to stay, but because she was afraid. And he had lived long enough to know that fear, born of too much suffering, could not be healed with promises, only with time and actions. But some days later, Josie discovered the truth about her mother when she called Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital to check on Carmen and casually asked about the anonymous charity that had paid the costs. The administrator said she could contact the Ashford Law Office, representing the fund, for details. The name Ashford made Josie freeze because she had seen it on Caruso Holdings' legal files while organizing papers in Dom's office. Theodore Ashford, Dom's personal lawyer, and everything shattered in her mind like glass struck by a stone. The transfer, the overdue bills erased, the private room at the best rehabilitation facility in Boston, all of it Dom. Josie entered Dom's office without knocking for the first time since she had come to the house. her eyes red not from sadness, but from anger because Josie Reyes had survived years on her own without taking handouts from anyone and had been proud of it even though it nearly killed her. She stood before Dom breathing hard as she demanded why he had not told her, whether he thought he could buy her by paying her mother's hospital bills. Dom watched her standing there, shaking with anger, and saw beneath it the fear of becoming indebted, of being bound by gratitude instead of free choice. Because Ryan had once used money and favors to control her before fists, and Dom understood that to Josie, kindness with conditions was more terrifying than open cruelty. He did not stand or move closer, only sat in his chair and said calmly that he had not bought her, that he cared for her mother because she deserved to be cared for, the same way Josie had cared for him when he did not deserve it, when he had thrown things and slammed tables and she cleaned without a word, when he pushed everyone away and she still left him notes wishing him good night, that she had not done those things for money and he had not done this to want anything from her. He had done it because it was right and because he had the means, and she should not have to carry everything alone. Josie stood still for a long time as the anger drained from her face, like mist under sunlight, replaced by something she had hidden for months. She began to cry, not from anger or sadness, but because for the first time, someone had carried part of her burden without demanding anything in return, because someone had seen her mother not as a financial weight, but as a human being who mattered. She cried from relief and gratitude because she had been strong alone for too long, and tonight she was allowed to be weak without fear of collapsing because someone was there to hold her up. But the calm barely settled before a new storm arrived because Franco Duca did not leave Boston as ordered, and instead went into hiding and planned revenge. Days after the birthday party, Dom received an unmarked envelope left at the gate. Inside, 5 photographs of Tommy playing at Boston Common with Josie shot from a distance with a telephoto lens, Tommy's face unmistakably clear, and a handwritten note with a single line telling Dom the kid was cute and to be careful. Paulie handed Dom the envelope and stepped back because he saw something few people ever had and lived to tell. Dom's eyes turning completely black, not the cold fury he had shown Franco at the party, but a deep burning rage from a place he had buried long ago, the rage of a man protecting a child he already considered his own, even if he had never said it aloud. He summoned his most loyal men within an hour with orders that allowed no deviation. Josie and Tommy were to be protected around the clock, 2 guards by day and 2 by night. Tommy was not to leave the mansion without at least 2 escorts, and any unfamiliar person approaching within 50 meters of the gate was to be identified immediately. At the same time, Dom called Theo Ashford to the house and handed him the full file Paulie had assembled on Franco's illegal dealings, including money laundering through shell companies, federal wire fraud, and ties to 2 rival crews in Charlestown, with one brief instruction to deliver it to the FBI cleanly with no Caruso trace. Theo passed the file to the Boston FBI office within 24 hours through an intermediary attorney. Days later, Franco Duca was arrested at a rented apartment in Revere in the early morning by an FBI task force on racketeering and wire fraud charges under RICO, facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison without early release. As Franco was cuffed and pushed into the vehicle, Dom stood on the Beacon Hill balcony watching Boston wake under the sunrise, reading Paulie's text, nodding once, and pocketing his phone. That afternoon, Dom called Josie into his office, and she entered with worried eyes because she had seen guards everywhere and knew something had happened. She was not told. Dom said calmly, each word heavy as steel, that Franco Duca had been arrested by the FBI that morning, that he would not walk free for 20 years, that no one would ever touch Tommy, no one in this world, and he swore it. Josie looked at Dom and saw not the promise of a mafia boss flexing power, but the oath of a man who kept her son's crayon drawings in his desk drawer, who had summoned his personal doctor during a blizzard, who had stood beside her in the dark with his hand on her shoulder as she knelt by her child's bed, crying without sound. For the first time, Josie did not step back. She stood there, met his gaze, and nodded. In the weeks after Franco was arrested, and Josie nodded in Dom's office that day, everything in the Beacon Hill mansion slowly found a new rhythm. The ghost of Bianca no longer drifted through the halls with her practiced smile. Franco's calculating gaze no longer swept every corner. The house felt lighter, as if someone had finally thrown open all the windows and let fresh air wash away the heaviness that had lingered for months. Dom and Josie did not announce anything to anyone. There were no dramatic kisses or ornate declarations. They simply stopped keeping their distance. Josie sat across from Dom at breakfast instead of standing to serve. In the evenings, they sat together on the living room sofa reading while Tommy played on the floor, and sometimes their hands brushed when they reached for the same cup of tea and neither pulled away anymore. Then that morning came, an ordinary morning like any other. Spring sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, laying warm golden squares across the wooden floor. Josie stood at the stove stirring oatmeal for Tommy. Dom sat at the head of the table with his coffee and the paper. Tommy sat in his high chair halfway through breakfast when the toddler suddenly wanted down. Josie unlatched the chair and set him on the floor, assuming he would toddle off to his toys as usual. But instead he turned and ran straight toward Dom, tiny feet pattering across the wood. Small arms lifted high, and from those little lips came two clear, bright syllables that rang through the sunlit kitchen. Dada. Josie froze by the stove, the wooden spoon slipping from her hand to the floor, her other hand flying to her mouth, because Tommy had never called anyone that in his life. The child was born without a father, grew up without knowing one, had never spoken that word. Now, the first time it left his mouth, it was not for Ryan Dutton, but for the man sitting at the head of the kitchen table with his newspaper suspended in midair. Dom looked as Tommy ran toward him, the paper falling to the table. When the child reached him with arms raised and called Dada again, Dom bent and lifted Tommy with both hands, the boy wrapping his arms tight around Dom's neck, his face pressed into Dom's shoulder. Dominic Caruso, the mafia boss who controlled half of Boston, the man the city feared, the man who had not cried when he lost his hearing, had not cried when he was betrayed, had not cried standing before nearly 100 people exposing the lies of his fiancée and his lieutenant, stood in the middle of the kitchen holding a 2-year-old child as tears ran down his cheeks, silent, unbroken sobs, just tears flowing as if the final wall he had built over 37 years had collapsed all at once, and everything it had held back was finally free. Josie rushed forward and wrapped her arms around both of them, one arm across Dom's back and the other around Tommy, her forehead resting against Dom's shoulder from the other side. The three of them stood there in the kitchen, holding one another. Tommy in the middle, clutching Dom's neck with his small hands, Dom holding Tommy with one arm and pulling Josie close with the other. Josie holding them both as if letting go would make them disappear. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Tommy had said it all with those 2 syllables. A 2-year-old who knew nothing of mafia or power or the Caruso empire, who only knew that this man lifted him every afternoon, bought him toys and hid them, summoned a private doctor during a blizzard, kept every crooked crayon drawing in his desk drawer. In the simple, pure logic of a child's world, a man like that could only be one thing: a father. Boston sunlight streamed through the kitchen window over the 3 of them standing there. The same kitchen where months earlier Josie had sat alone crying in the middle of the night over hospital debt letters. The same kitchen where Dom had once written, "Sit down and have tea with me," on a scrap of paper and slid it across the table, now filled with warmth and light. The sound of Dada still echoed in the air like the most beautiful sound the once completely deaf ears of Dominic Caruso would ever hear. Several months after that morning when Tommy said "da" in that sun-filled kitchen, on an ordinary evening when Josie laid Tommy into his crib and went downstairs to make tea out of habit, she noticed a neatly arranged stack of papers on the kitchen table, where she usually left notes for Dom. She opened it and her knees gave out, so she had to grab the edge of the table because it was not a business contract or Caruso Holdings paperwork, but official adoption documents. Thomas Miguel Caruso. Tommy's name printed in legal ink carrying the Caruso surname. Dom's signature already at the bottom with a space waiting for Josie's. Clipped beneath the papers was a small, simple diamond ring. Not a flashy 5-carat piece like the one Bianca once wore, but a perfectly sized, elegant ring, along with a note written in Dom's familiar handwriting that said, "The adoption papers are the real gift. The ring is just extra if you say yes." Josie sank to the kitchen floor, clutching the papers to her chest, and sobbed. When Dom stepped into the kitchen and stood in the doorway watching her, she looked up at him through tear-soaked eyes and nodded, nodding without being able to speak because every word was unnecessary. The wedding took place on a golden autumn day at St. Leonard's Church in Boston's North End, the oldest Italian Catholic church in New England, nestled in the neighborhood where Dom's grandfather immigrated from Sicily nearly a century earlier. Dom chose it not for grandeur, but for roots because he wanted to stand where Caruso blood first touched American soil to begin the next chapter of his life. The church was simply decorated, white roses lining the aisle, white candles glowing on every pew, autumn sunlight filtering through stained glass and scattering red, blue, and gold across the ancient stone floor. The guest list was small because Dom invited only those who truly mattered. In the first pew on the right, Carmen Reyes sat in her wheelchair wearing a light lavender dress Josie had bought for her. Her legs amputated to the knees, covered with a flower-embroidered blanket. Her face thinner than before, but her eyes bright and tears streaming down her lined cheeks from the moment her daughter walked in, because she had prayed for years, asking God to give her daughter happiness. Today that prayer had been answered. Tommy wore a tiny custom-made vest as the ring bearer, but at 2.5 years old he had no idea what a ring bearer was supposed to do. So he ran up and down the aisle between the pews, tripped over Carmen's footrest and almost fell, ran up to the altar and back down again. The entire church laughed while Josie shook her head smiling, and Dom stood at the altar looking at his son with an expression no one would have believed possible months earlier. Paulie stood beside Dom as best man, his eyes wet. When someone asked if he was all right, he answered in a hoarse voice that it was autumn pollen allergies, then turned away to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand, even though everyone knew there was no pollen in Boston in October. Regina Palmer and her husband sat in the third row, Dr. Harrison Webb in the fourth, and scattered among them were familiar faces who had witnessed Dom and Josie's journey from that birthday party night to this moment. Josie walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, not a $10,000 designer gown, but one she chose herself from a small shop in Dorchester where she once lived. Her dark hair loose over her shoulders, holding a small bouquet of white roses, with no father to walk her down the aisle. So she walked alone between the rows of candles, and she walked with the steps of a woman who had walked alone for years and did not need anyone to guide her. But today was the last time she would walk alone because after this, she never would be again. When Josie reached the altar, Dom took her hand and they faced one another. Dom's vows were not written by a lawyer or wedding planner, but spoken by a man who had lived in silence for months and now understood the weight of every sound. Josie, you came when I had nothing left but silence. You stayed when everyone else walked away. You wrote me goodnight notes when the world thought I was finished. Your voice was the first sound that brought me back. I cannot promise a perfect life because I am not a perfect man. But I promise that from today on you will know you are loved every day. You will know you are not alone. And our son will grow up knowing that family is not what you are born into, but what you choose. Josie's vows were shorter because she had to stop twice to catch her breath through tears. But every word came from the deepest place inside her. Dom, you taught me that strength is not never falling, but letting someone help you stand back up. You gave Tommy a father I never dared to dream he would have. You gave me a home when I had forgotten what having a home felt like. I love you not because you are Dominic Caruso, but because you are the man who keeps every crooked drawing our son makes in his desk drawer. The man who wrote, "Sit down and have tea with me" on a piece of paper in the middle of the night. I love you for who you are, when it is just the three of us in the kitchen and no one is watching. The small reception was held back at the Beacon Hill mansion. During it, Dom stood to announce two things. First, that he had founded the Miguel Reyes Scholarship Fund for first-generation students, a scholarship named after Josie's late father for first-generation college students from immigrant families. When Josie heard her father's name, she cried while Carmen clutched her daughter's hand and cried with her. Second, Dom looked at Josie and announced that the Caruso family was expecting a new member, and it took the room a moment to understand before it erupted. Carmen cried harder. Tommy clapped without knowing why, and Paulie did not even bother pretending allergies this time and wiped his tears openly, saying he did not care, making everyone laugh. That night, after the guests had gone and Tommy was asleep, Dom and Josie stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the lights of Boston below. The same balcony where months earlier, Dom had sat alone in the dark, listening to Josie sing Tommy to sleep through an open window, unable to name the feeling in his chest. Dom said quietly, "Sometimes I am grateful for the accident that night." Josie looked at him in surprise, and Dom continued, "Because losing my hearing was the only way I could hear what mattered most." Josie asked what that was. Dom looked out over the city, then back at her. "The sound of you singing to Tommy in Spanish outside my door, the sound of you telling him I deserve to be loved, and the sound of my son calling me Dad." Josie rested her head on Dom's shoulder, and they stood there in the cool Boston night. The city awake and moving beneath Beacon Hill, but on that balcony, time stood still for two people who found each other where no one expected. A once-deaf mafia boss and a housekeeper from Dorchester who taught each other that real love does not arrive like lightning, but through small handwritten notes left on the table each morning, shared cups of tea in the middle of the night, and a tiny hand resting on the cheek of the loneliest man in the city. As for Bianca Whitfield, after Franco was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, she was completely abandoned by him. With no Caruso money and no promises left, she sold her designer items and moved into a modest apartment in Quincy, working retail at a shopping mall. Occasionally at Boston charity events, Dom and Josie saw her from afar without hatred, because they understood that Bianca's betrayal was a disguised gift that led them exactly where they belonged. If this story teaches us anything, it is that life sometimes has to take away what we value most so we can see what was truly precious beside us all along. That real strength does not live in power or money, but in the courage to open your heart when everything teaches you to close it. That true love does not need conditions or perfection, only honesty. And that sometimes the person who changes your life is not the strongest or the richest, but the gentlest one. The one who writes goodnight notes every evening, the one who sings a lullaby they think no one is listening to. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss new stories each day. Let us know in the comments how Dom and Josie's story resonated with you, whether you have ever met someone who arrived when you thought you had nothing left, because we read every comment and listened to every feeling you share from the heart. We wish all of you watching good health, daily peace, and a life filled with the people you love. Thank you, and we will see you in the next video.